Hospitalisation. I knew it would end this way. Fortunately, I feel no pain. I'm fine. I wish I'd done and said more. If I could go back, I'd make different choices, brave ones, but now it's too late and my time is almost up. He felt calm, serene, probably due to the powerful cocktail of painkillers administered by the paramedics in the ambulance whilst it raced desperately along the highway to save his life. They had swiftly responded to an anonymous call from the cool voice of a middle-aged man, to arrive just in time to find him lying on the edge of a pavement, lifeless by some rubbish bins. The nurses pushed the stretcher as fast as they could, causing the unconscious patient to jolt at every change of direction along the corridor that led to the reanimation room, where the surgeon prepared for an emergency operation should his heart not beat regularly immediately after defibrillation. The semi-conscious patient did not understand what was happening around him. With his ears blocked, he could hear his heart beat slowly and intermittently. He could only see a bright white light before his eyes and the latex gloves snap onto the doctor's hands, applied by his assistants in haste. A shrill voice cut through the chaos of fermenting personnel around the patient, advising, "He's about to go into cardiac arrest." His blood pressure was high, his pupils dilated and his breath weak, almost absent. His conditions were very poor and they would probably have lost him. Sometimes wishes do come true. Chester's wish was to die quickly, and it seemed it had been granted. He had never feared death, but suffering illness, watching his life go out slowly and helplessly was his worst nightmare. He had escaped slow agony. After all, there was nobody left behind, no one to suffer his loss. He was alone. Perhaps no gravestone would be bought and engraved for him. Not a soul would have remembered him because no one would have missed him. He had had a heart attack as he threw an unwanted letter in the bins around the corner from his home. An unexpected pain came, not from outside, as perhaps one might expect, but from within. All the guilt, the sense of inferiority brought on by being let down at work and the final repudiation by the woman he considered his soulmate, had taken their toll. All his suffering came to the brim and his heart gave. It's unknown to us by what mechanism, but if one should wish to end one's sufferings for a world that doesn't want us, mind and body will achieve that goal quite quickly. Chester's time was all it took to open a letter he had just been handed by the postman, which read in large, bold characters that someone wanted money, a lot of money. He had time to walk downstairs, reach the bin and throw away that cursed and arrogant demand. But he fell short of tearing it up. He could only rest on the filthy lid and touch the deep wound on his forehead, falling to the ground in an epileptic fit before his heart stopped. Amongst the general indifference of passers-by, who kicked him out of their way with their clean shoes, someone had pity, understood the gravity of the situation and took it upon himself to call for help. Meanwhile, the man knelt by his side and administered a tempestuous and efficient heart massage, trying to save his life. Life is a long thread rolled into a ball. From birth it slowly unravels and at the end your eyes close. During its course you may have never smoked, drunk, you may have been chased, exercised, but once you reach the end nothing more can be done. The switch of terrestrial life is turned off and everything goes out. But if some yarn is left, if we are still allowed to keep our eyes open, there is no sickness or misfortune that can take over. You keep living. His strength seemed gone. He could not open his eyes. His joints were killing him. At every tiny movement his knees, elbows and shoulders shot pain through him like burning needles stuck into his skin. His mind, on the other hand, was on overdrive, and he asked himself how many hours he had passed unconscious and if the operation had gone well. He was aware how lucky he was to still be alive, and he wondered if his legs still worked, if he had been left paralyzed, or worse, whether he had been forced to rely on life support machines, in which case he would have asked for the plug to be pulled. A nurse rushed into the room, took the chair by the table at the end of the bed and positioned it by Chester's body. She sat on it, crossed her legs and held the medical card with both hands. She took off her glasses and rested them on the sheet, upon his stony legs, and, understanding he was awake, she said, "You had a heart attack, caused by excessive stress and an intestinal block that clogged your arteries. We have found and removed a tapeworm from your stomach, about 1 meter long. Shocked by the news, Chester gathered all his strength to raise his head and raised the sheet and cleared the hospital gown off his body to reveal stitching right across his abdomen and more over his heart. About the length of a bottle of beer were stitches that ran from his neck to his sternum. He immediately realized it had not been an ordinary recovery, but that the latex-covered hands he so clearly remembered snap like whips had undertaken a long, delicate, and difficult operation. It had gone well, otherwise he would not have been able to see the result. Or rather, his life in peril reflected on those menacing dressings. The nurse bent over to pick up her glasses. Chester was still disorientated, but not enough not to notice the lack of underwear beneath the white uniform of his young nurse, who, oblivious of his searching eyes upon her, put on the glasses and resumed her telling of events. Someone had called the paramedics who, having rushed to his aid, found a man who claimed to be a passing soldier who had been dexterously administering CPR on him. He told them where the patient lived, observing that he was just wearing light pajamas and slippers. The patient had been rushed to hospital, where to his great fortune a specialist surgeon was at hand to carry out an emergency operation to remove the obstruction in his coronary artery and, immediately afterwards, removing the long parasite from his intestine. The nurse hinted at a smile and said, "Boy, you have been lucky," and she explained that, had he not had that heart attack, that horrendous beast would have killed silently within a few hours. He would have died slowly, perhaps not realizing anything was wrong. He would have gone to bed like any other night, but not woken up the following morning. In all that tragedy he had actually been very lucky. As he listened, Chester wanted to move, but every movement of his joints was too painful. She reassured him by stroking his shoulder and saying that such pain was normal, as he had been lying in bed for over a week. The first thing in Chester's mind, amidst the pain and his aridly thirsty mouth, was who would have looked after him all those days? Who had washed and changed him? Who had fitted his catheter and cared for his wounds? He was upset and embarrassed at the thought of a stranger's hands on him, although he would not have minded if those hands had belonged to the beautiful and voluptuous nurse at his side now. He may have had a brush-off with death, but his hormonal instincts were very much alive, and it had been months since his wife had so much as reached out to him. He felt the stitches on his abdomen tug. His mind flooded with thoughts of how much time he must have spent under the knife and how many bags of blood must have been needed, if the vast amount of blood-stained bandages was anything to go by. Seeing him recover properly, the woman told him how the surgeon had raised his hands to heaven and thanked whoever had given him strength to carry out 13 long hours of concentrated work, never taking his hands off him, telling his colleagues that he had been supported by a mysterious force from behind. It had been like a gentle and loving hand, but strong and resolute. Otherwise he would have never have managed at his age. He was proud of what he had achieved and to have saved another life before his retirement. Still tired and upset, Chester asked whether he had had any visitors. The answer was that, as he had no documents on him when he was found, it was only last night that his wife was informed, mostly thanks to the detailed testimony of the passer-by who had rescued him, who had pointed to a door on a first-floor flat around the corner as Chester's possible habitation. Strangely, the door was locked from the inside, and only the police could break in to assess the situation and find his documents. But the police had not been involved immediately, because all officers had been set out to find a man responsible for a double murder some yards away from where Chester had been found. 2 unidentifiable men armed with guns and silencers had been inexplicably murdered, as if pierced by a burning sword. Their wounds were deadly, but scarred instantly. The only person who had insistently asked after Chester's recovery had been the passing soldier, who had remained in the waiting room until an hour before he woke up. He had spent every night there, drinking dozens of coffees, like a stalker, refusing to talk with anyone. Members of staff had assumed that his strange behavior was due to a lack of permit, as a soldier would not be allowed to spend the night away from the barracks. The woman now by Chester's side had herself been surprised at how the man savored each sip of coffee, as if he had never drank coffee in his life. He vanished just as the police arrived to bring the doctor on duty a search warrant for Chester's flat and its results. Chester widened his eyes in disbelief, wondering what could have been found in his home so illegal as to call for a full warrant. The nurse perceived his distress and immediately reassured him that the warrant had been requested by the doctors, to assess whether he had been taking medications prior to his heart attack and whether any medical records could be found which showed him to be following a course of medication which could explain why blood tests showed traces of strychnine, a toxic and lethal substance commonly found in rat poison. Chester could not understand how such powerful poison could be in his body. He also had no idea how the door to his apartment could have been locked from the inside, as he did not remember leaving by the window. Although he had done that once, to avoid a couple of nasty-looking men who appeared to be waiting for him under the stairs, by the door of his landlord, a sly old man who in his boredom would pop outside every time he heard a sound. He was so mistrusting that he had security cameras installed to check the stairs and Chester's own front door, careless of privacy law. He painfully gathered all his strength and sat up in bed, as the woman kindly helped him by arranging some pillows to support his back. He reached for the bottle of water on his bedside table. He was so thirsty and his mouth felt sticky and dry, like the time he tried drugs as a boy, convinced by friends on a night out clubbing. The nurse, always kind and helpful, seeing his difficulty opened and passed him the bottle of mineral water. Chester took it with one, then with both hands, realizing then that the drip needle was falling off, releasing some drops of blood. Seeing that bright red fluid he felt faint, for he had always hated and avoided needles. The woman smiled amused by this man who was so big and strong, yet afraid of a little blood. She jotted some notes onto the medical card, telling him that, if the doctors agreed, he could have concluded his convalescence at home in less than a week. Chester sighed deeply, thinking about the fact that his home was no longer his. Meanwhile, he had to undertake a physiotherapy program for his rehabilitation and to get his strength back. Another thing he had to do before leaving hospital was to sit a few sessions with the Institute's psychiatrist. "Why do I need a psychiatrist?" he asked, perturbed. The woman eased him, explaining it was a routine requirement following every operation. It was for his own good. He would have been advised on living with heart problems, how he should eat and what sport he could carry out regularly. She got up to leave, but first, seeing him sad and disheartened, she rested a hand on his shoulder in support, to show him that he was not alone. As she opened the door to leave, a very young and slender assistant, very short but well-proportioned, slipped into the room whistling a tune as she pushed a wheelchair. Chester was sitting on the bed and their heads were almost level with each other. With her loud and chirpy voice, the skinny little girl invited her new patient to sit in the wheelchair, as she quickly moved around the bed to painlessly remove the drip from his arm and ironically said, "You've had 20 of these. You were way too thirsty," she laughed. Chester did not find the sentence amusing at all and did not lock. Instead, with a grin of superiority, he held onto his bottle with one hand and with the other removed the sheet off his legs, with the help of the cute little physiotherapist assistant. Whimpering, he painfully sat onto the wheelchair and was swiftly pushed up to the lift by such a supernatural strength Chester would have never guessed could have belonged to that little woman. As they descended to the basement, Chester's stomach cramped as he suddenly thought of a possible reason why the police had broken into his apartment. Perhaps they had sought proof of unpaid taxes and charge him with aggravated tax fraud. They would certainly have arrested him as soon as he left the hospital, perhaps using the psychiatric sessions to assess whether he was mentally stable and, should that be the case, bang him up and throw away the key. He had to do something to preserve his freedom, but what could he do? He was so weak that simply getting agitated could have caused him a second heart attack and probably a deadly one, therefore running away was out of the question. He needed a guarantor, someone who could state before a court that he was a good, honest, hard-working man. But who? Diana had thrown him out and threatened to kill him. His work colleagues were a bunch of ass-licking morons. His few motorcycle buddies were alcoholics, some ex-convicts. He was ruined, destined to spend the rest of his youth in jail, as if he had not suffered enough in his life, yet more pain awaited him. But he had a suddenly comforting stroke of genius, a magnificent idea, so ingenious that he was amazed at himself. He would feign insanity, appear crazy, out of his mind, a madman, so that even the cheapest and inexperienced of lawyers could have appealed on his behalf on grounds of mental infirmity. He would have got away with house arrest, perhaps just a fine. He could not have asked for more, but he had to get busy convincing everyone at the hospital that he was insane, starting with the physiotherapist. Chester started to whimper and complain, trying to salivate. Then he opened the bottle of water he was holding and started to pour it out onto the floor. The young lady promptly picked up the lid off the floor and secured it onto the bottle so tightly that Chester could not undo it, so he tried another move. Exiting the lift, there was a huge swimming pool and to the left a gym for rehabilitation. Chester moved his arms heavily by the wheels, as to block their movement, but the girl pushed harder, without any difficulty. She put weights into the patient's hands and explained how to use them, but every time she did so, he opened his hands and let them fall to the ground, laughing like an idiot, making rude and malicious signals to the bottle he had stuck between his legs. The young woman understood very well the reasons behind his vulgarity and acting like such a vulgar and wild animal, but amongst her many virtues, she had an infinite patience, even when, as she moved close to take the pajama sleeve out of his mouth, he vehemently placed both his hands on her breasts. Unfazed, she pulled harder at the garment between his teeth and replaced the rehab weights in his hands, which he promptly dropped onto the floor with a calm but idiotic smile. The girl sighed, but then smiled, as she knew better than to fall for this sort of ridiculous tricks, and she got him to stand, helping him to lay down on the massage table, so she could massage him upper limbs. She stood on one side and started massaging from the elbow to the shoulder, by which point Chester's hand was free to rest on the physiotherapist's firm buttock. This time her reaction was unforgiving. She removed his hand somewhat violently and pressed it against his shoulder blade and arm in what looked like the move of a karate master, but passed for stretching. Awahai. Chester was still weak. He had only recently woken up after a major operation, but his painful scream could be heard up to the top floor. He had never felt so much pain in his life. He could literally feel his bones crunching. The muscles on his neck and arm were stretched so much he could tear at any moment. He no longer thought of the plan to feign insanity, but only of how many interminable seconds he was going to have to suffer in pain. He could not understand how such a puny little creature could have so much strength, but he understood very well that she was using it against him. She seemed to calm down, and he gathered his breath, thinking that the worst must have been over, when suddenly she was by his other side repeating the same exercise, harder this time. He was exhausted and could not even open his mouth. She left him like that for a few seconds and then carried him onto his wheelchair. He watched her quietly and in fear. He was at her mercy, and his face spoke for him with a clear expression, mercy, all covered in sweat, like a hippopotamus in a sauna. Once what passed for more than stress release than therapy was over, she was gentle and kind again, as she wiped a cool towel on his face and dried him with some paper. As they returned to the lift, he became curious of her name and asked her, quietly, with his mouth dry, sticky, and bitter. The side effects of anesthetics, and the last thing he wanted, more physical discomfort. Aura, came the jolly answer, as the girl kept pushing. She was a girl of a sunny disposition, and her cheerful attitude was infectious. He would have loved to know her better, talk with her from time to time, and, once out of hospital, he could have asked her out to dinner. But the massage had taken away what little strength he had. Besides, he had a more important mission to accomplish. He had to pass for a madman and could not. He must not fraternize with the enemy. Chester did not know that Aura was not only a physiotherapist, but also an accomplished psychologist, and her job was to be at his side and look after him until the head physician did not feel satisfied with his recovery and granted his release from hospital. That date seemed close because he reacted well to medication. His blood was clear of the poison, and the incisions made had almost entirely healed, thanks to a novel use of laser technology which replaced the surgeon's knife, of which he unwittingly had had the honor of being the first trial, without any side effects. This was one of the reasons why the old surgeon had been overjoyed. Once in his room, Chester had to decide quickly what to do, whether to relax and regain strength or keep on playing the madman to convince the girl. He diabolically opted for the latter. It was a perfect opportunity. He was right next to the ECG machine, a tall, thin cabinet with lots of cables, which he could easily knock down. But quick as a flash, Aura moved him away from temptation, pulling his wheelchair back. Chester did not give up and grabbed a gown from a hook, in the hope that at least the coat hanger might fall and break 1 or 2 floor tiles. Unfortunately, just as he started pulling, all his strength mysteriously vanished, and all the damage he managed was a flat mewling sound as he tried, but nothing more. Or rather, he did manage one more thing. He had peed in his pants. That wasn't really in his plans, but it did do the job. The liquid dripped slowly from his thigh to his foot, and when it wet the floor he began to feel a little ashamed of himself, because as he raised his head, he realized that perhaps he had gone over the top, as Aura was getting rather angry. Gritting her teeth and with tight lips, she glared at him in a way that made him feel dirtier and more disgusting than that urine. Chester smiled, hoping for forgiveness from that immensely kind creature, and it worked. Aura sighed deeply a couple of times, probably concentrating on calming herself down. Then she rushed to the bathroom and returned with a roll of paper roughly the size of a watermelon, then said, "If you have the strength to grab my arse, I'm sure you'll manage to clean up that filth on your own." Chester did not answer. He slowly unrolled some of the paper and dried the seat he was on, then bent to one side to dry his leg and the wheelchair. He sat up slowly only when he heard a telephone. It was Aura's cell phone ringing. It was a call from the ward assistant, saying that the psychiatrist had arrived and that Aura was required to take the patient to see him. The brief call was received on speakerphone, so Chester understood the time had come to do his best to make those people in white coats that he was absolutely crazy. Aura grabbed the wheelchair and pushed it out of the room while she explained to Chester the reason of that visit. He remained speechless. Perhaps his plan had failed, but it was no longer his main concern. In his apartment, the police had found some bottles of concentrated acid, a car battery charger plugged into an electric socket, a portable blowtorch ready for use, and, the most suspect find, a gas mask. Before releasing him, the head physician had to ascertain that he was not a suicidal maniac or worse, a murderer. At home he had all he would need for a robbery, perhaps at a bank or a jewelry. They certainly were no ordinary household items. At Aura's explanation, Chester shook his head disapprovingly and laughed through gritted teeth. When they arrived at the psychiatrist's office, someone was inside, but a notice on the door clearly stated, "Do not disturb." They had to wait, so Aura parked Chester with his back against a wall of the impossibly long corridor, and she sat on the metal bench next to him, crossing her skinny legs and admiring her fingernails. Chester perceived from her expression that she thought of the varnish on those nails as a work of art, with their intricate designs, sparkles, and symbols. With a satisfied smile, she showed them to her friend by placing her hand close to his face and exclaimed, "They are beautiful. They were free too. I love my friend. She is amazing." Chester put on a fake smile. He had never understood women and their weird fancies, but their appreciation of colorful fingernails was beyond his comprehension. He could have understood excitement at a new set of tires for a motorbike. Aura persisted in talking to her fingernails. She was beside herself with enthusiasm to the extent that she moved on that bench as if bitten by a snake. Chester became extremely serious and considered that perhaps she ought to have a chat with the psychiatrist herself.